The film kicks off on a small island off the west coast, where a photographer named Samuel wanders about, snapping shots. He notices that most of the folks he captures are dozing off in odd spots. Turns out, the island's been hit by a weird crisis. 3 days back, people started nodding off out of the blue, in the middle of car rides, in saunas, even while underwater. At first, onlookers were just baffled, but soon they figured out that those who dozed wouldn't wake up, almost like they were in a coma. Quite a few doctors and researchers have shown up in the past 3 days, but no one's found a fix for this strange epidemic. At this point, all the island's regular residents are asleep, some lucky ones at home, others at work, and some even in the grocery store or in their cars. Their bodies are ticking along fine, except if they're moved from where they first fell asleep, their pulse shoots way up. A curious thing about this whole situation is that it doesn't affect those who weren't living on the island before this happened. So, scientists have set up a camp and tagged every sleeping person to keep tabs on them. Right now, no reporters are allowed in the infected area, but somehow Samuel's managed to slip through the chaos. During his escapade, he steps into a bus full of sleeping passengers to snap some shots. He comes across a woman holding a live goldfish and decides to take it along. In this strange scenario, Samuel feels like the fish is his only companion and he talks to it as such. A while later, they end up at a house that looks suitable to spend a few days in. Samuel treads carefully and finds a woman sleeping on a bed. Her name's Stella, and she was one of the fortunate ones to fall asleep last. Samuel avoids invading her privacy and stays in another room, unaware that the researchers are outside his house, guarding the area. Since everyone who's awake has been told to leave the island, he's worried he'll be in trouble if he's found. The next day, Samuel dreams of going to the grocery store and bumping into Stella, but she barely acknowledges him. He's jolted awake when he calls her by name and she questions how he knows it. A new day ushers in a fresh adventure for Samuel as he chats with a sleeping Stella while listening to the radio news. The whole world is abuzz about the pandemic and strange controversies are starting to pop up. Chuckling at them, Samuel decides to explore the island in the daylight. The first person he spots is a handyman, dozing off by a tree, looking peaceful. He also discovers that the animals on the island are still alive and wonders who's looking after them. After about an hour of strolling, he arrives at the church, where a large group of people are out cold. After snapping a few pictures, Samuel settles into a seat and falls asleep. In his dream, he and Stella are seated across from each other in a restaurant. They behave like they've known each other forever and chat about what Samuel's up to on the island. Stella isn't pleased that he's capitalizing on the situation for money, but Samuel argues that he's there for the experience, not the cash. Later on, he returns home and sifts through Stella's things to find her daily journal. As he reads it, his bond with Stella grows stronger, and he continues to dream about her. In the dream, she confides in him that she was among the last to be affected. The first person she saw succumb was her piano teacher, who nodded off right in the middle of a class. When asked if she was scared, Stella admits she was more bewildered. The doctors and researchers arrived but only figured out that people shouldn't be moved from where they dozed off. Stella finds it amusing that there's a chance her heart might race if she tries to get up from her bed. Samuel seizes the moment to inquire about how she felt when she fell asleep. Stella describes it as a surreal sensation. She had peculiar, vivid dreams and eventually became immersed in them, unaware that she was slipping into a deep slumber. The scene shifts to the next day, and Samuel embarks on another venture. This time, he explores a different neighborhood and comes across a car brimming with balloons. While attempting to photograph it, he spots health workers nearby and has to dash back home. This incident jolts Samuel back to reality, and he resolves to leave the island, having captured enough images. He bids farewell to Stella, packs his things, and heads to the shore where his boat awaits. Yet, after spending a considerable time gazing at the boat, he has a change of heart. Just as he arrives back home, he notices the faucet is running. Samuel recalls that it was on when he first entered the house, but he's sure he turned it off. Suddenly, he's transported back to his dream, seated across from Stella at the restaurant. She inquires about the true reason for his visit to the island. Samuel finally comes clean, revealing that he came for her. Turns out, a year ago, he was on the island for vacation when he spotted Stella at the grocery store. He followed her to a restaurant later that day where she seemed carefree and youthful, which piqued his interest. But before he could ask for her number, the night ended, and he never got another chance to meet her. Back in reality, Samuel goes to the grocery store to shop, but two researchers come in to buy some alcohol at the same time. One of them accidentally bumps into Samuel, but he avoids being caught by pretending to be unconscious. After they leave, he happily gathers essentials and even pays the sleeping cashier before taking the groceries home. Afterward, we see him wandering around Stella's house, inspecting her belongings and imagining what her personality must be like. He strikes gold when he discovers a tape recorder in the attic that holds recordings of her favorite things. The list includes random items like the sound of a typewriter, headless Barbie dolls, and flamingo floaties. The more Samuel listens, the deeper his infatuation grows. On the tape, Stella describes that driving on the beach is her favorite thing to do. So, Samuel envisions himself and Stella outside, searching for a car to take to the beach. He's apprehensive about taking from sleeping people, but Stella reassures him that they're simply borrowing. They eventually find a car they like and break into the owner's house to find the keys. Samuel revels in Stella's free-spirited nature and begins to believe that she's more than just a product of his imagination. A while later, he awakens to the sound of a car outside and spots two health workers entering the house for their weekly checkup. He hastily gathers all his belongings and hides in a closet just seconds before being discovered. The workers examine Stella for any abnormalities and leave shortly after. Samuel spends the rest of his day lying beside Stella's bed and conversing with her. The following day, he once again ascends to the attic and plays the second part of her tape. This time, she talks about the things she dislikes and confesses that she feels lonely and vulnerable. Samuel wishes he could do something to comfort her, which in turn, leaves him feeling helpless. Yet again, he slips into his imagination and engages in conversation with her. The two discuss soulmates and contemplate whether they might be each other's, but Stella remains skeptical. Returning to reality, Samuel ultimately decides to head back home, feeling that he no longer has a reason to stay on the island. He makes it halfway to the dock but finds himself unable to leave Stella behind. That night, he returns home and indulges in Stella's stash, daydreaming about sharing a smoke with her. From that point on, he takes it upon himself to experience all the things that were on Stella's list of favorite activities. He cooks lasagna and sips beer from a wine glass for the same reason. When slightly tipsy, Stella appears in his dreams, expressing frustration at him for not giving her space. She asserts that the version of herself he knows from her writings and recordings isn't truly her. Samuel comes to understand that she's right. After all, he's never actually interacted with her in real life, and their relationship exists solely in his imagination. As he attempts to convince himself that coming to the island wasn't a mistake, Stella implores him to leave her alone and vanishes into the darkness. In the subsequent scene, Samuel once again resolves to leave, but this time, his journey takes a different turn. He becomes incredibly thirsty and experiences strange hallucinations along the way. To quench his thirst, he breaks into an apartment, but the more he drinks, the thirstier he becomes. The walls start closing in, filling him with anxiety, and it dawns on him that he's about to fall asleep like the others. Struggling to stay awake, he receives a call from the imaginary Stella, urging him back home. Suddenly, he jolts awake and rushes back to her house, asserting that if falling asleep is inevitable, he'd prefer to do so close to her. The next morning, to Samuel's astonishment, he awakens. However, he's unsure how long he can remain awake. Seizing the opportunity, he writes notes for Stella in case she ever gets a chance to read them. It consumes his entire day, and in the end, he, too, falls into a coma. Time passes, and a few days later, Stella stirs in her slumber. Things take a turn when she opens her eyes, wide awake after being asleep for over a week. She realizes she has no energy and heads to the faucet for water. It's then that she spots a second toothbrush on the counter and deduces that someone else has been living with her. Approaching the sleeping Samuel cautiously, Stella is more puzzled than frightened. She wants to wake him, but after a few attempts, she gives up. The house is filled with random objects she adores, like a headless Barbie and a giant flamingo floatie. Stella is pleasantly surprised to see them, but her joy dissipates as soon as she learns that Samuel read her journals and listened to her tapes. In a fit of anger, she strikes him repeatedly and discovers the notes he wrote for her. In them, he apologizes for invading her privacy and assures her that she's just like everyone else. He acknowledges that feeling lonely and building a defense system is okay but implores her to be herself. The notes overwhelm Stella as she realizes that the stranger in her house knows her inside out, and she, 2. Feels like she's known him forever. Over the next few days, she has several dreams with Samuel in them. They discuss his likes, dislikes, fears, and responsibilities, just as he did with her in his dreams. Despite never having met in person, Stella knows they share a profound connection. As a result, she cares for him as he did for her. Then comes the morning when Stella wakes up later than usual to a delightful surprise. Samuel is no longer on the sofa where he was sleeping. The two encounter each other in the kitchen for the first time, but to them, it feels like the reunion of long-lost lovers. Samuel introduces himself and shakes her hand, thrilled to discover that she is just as elated to meet him.